Okay, good morning again. So it's a good time to talk about God, right? Right after breakfast. In the spirit of full disclosure and transparency, I think it's good to begin with sharing my own experiences, my personal journey in the context of God and faith and all that's associated with it. So I grew up in a very traditional Jewish home. I went to Chabad schools, Crown Heights. And one would call, even though I don't like the term ultra-Orthodox, as you know from my talk yesterday, but it was very intense. And we're talking about schooling that began 7 o'clock in the morning and ended up in 8, 9 at night. And if you're familiar with the yeshiva intensity, that's what I grew up in. The good news is that I grew up also in a non-dogmatic home. My father was a journalist. Both my parents were very well-read, intelligent, open-minded, and nothing was ever imposed upon us. I'm the oldest of 5 children. So we really, I, for one, by nature, much more skeptical than just accepting. So it really was a very healthy environment for me, because though I grew up with all the intensity and all the laws and rules and so on, but it was in a very light and flexible, non-rigid approach, which allowed me to explore my own mind and ask questions. I wasn't silenced, and I wasn't abused in the name of religion. So that's what I must begin with, because I had friends who grew up in very dogmatic and very angry and fear-based homes, where religion and Judaism and God and holidays and mitzvahs were all presented in a very negative way. And it had its own effects. I would even say damaging effects. I don't know your own backgrounds. We live in a very diverse world today. There are many Jews that grew up with what I just described, but rarely do you find someone very intense and no dogma. I have to say, I didn't have any negative experiences per se. No one molested me. I wasn't hurt by rabbis or by the system, so I don't carry any anger. But for me, it was frankly much more, I would say much more of an intellectual exploration as opposed to an emotional one. So it wasn't due to any negative things. It was simply that I felt surrounded by a lot of mediocrity and a lot of imposition, and I didn't feel the passion, excitement about Judaism. And again, I have to qualify, I did grow up in a very warm and loving home, and Passover Seder's were beautiful, my grandparents' house, relatives and so on, but still, it was not enough for me really. And as I grew into a teenager, I realized that this is the system I'm in, and I used to wonder, my skepticism took me to the extent where I used to wonder whether the whole thing is in some man-made type of mind control to keep everybody in line, a program, and it was really did not encourage free inquiry. Things had to be accepted. This is the way it was. And I was a very voracious reader. I was reading all types of books from, to be honest, Christian thought, Far Eastern, Buddhism, and many variations within that itself, Greek philosophies, and I was really exploring. I kept it mostly to myself because I was wise enough to know that it wasn't exactly acceptable reading. And I realized that asking questions wasn't always also readily welcomed. So I just had my own little inner life, and I did not really know where I'm going to go with my life. I remember asking my father And he told me wisely, even though at the time I was frustrated, he said, you're going to have to figure it out on your own. That's how it works, like we all do. So I remember I really loved physics and mathematics. So I thought maybe I'd go to college, study some physics. But then it wasn't necessarily a passion of mine either, because I didn't see myself as a physicist or as a theoretical scientist or something. So, on the other hand, I have to say, I was quite intrigued by the fact that Judaism was here for over 3,000 years. And it was hard for me to imagine that Jews were all buying into a system blindly, because I knew Jews as being intelligent people, many, many skeptics. And hard to accept that they all just bought into a mind control system and been passing that on through all the trials and tribulations. So I couldn't dismiss the fact that there was the time-tested element that Judaism carried. So make a long story short, I came to realize at some point that some things are not provable. The idea that prove God's existence, for example, to me at least, I found that for every proof there was also a proof the other way around. And then I came to realize something else, that frankly, if God created proof and logic, it doesn't make sense that proof has to prove God, because prior to logic and proofs was God. And do I want a God that is a product of my logic? And as I said, I'm not going to share all my back and forth, but it's very relevant to this discussion. I would love to hear your own thoughts on the matter, and maybe we'll have some time later at the end of this talk to hear. So I came to the understanding was that, that God is something that's really not about proofs, not a mathematical or scientific theory. It's if it has any meaning, it must be some type of higher truth. And I decided when I was around 17 to go to a yeshiva college where I would be able to have the freedom and be really almost secluded, like a real college campus, and just explore, throw myself into the books. I realized knowledge is power. I need to hear the great sages as if I was sitting with them over lunch. I want to hear what they have to say, not filtered through the rabbis or teachers that I was exposed to. Because I didn't want to hear people's interpretation. I wanted to hear it like straight. Like if I sat with Rashi, or with Moses, or with Rabbi Akiva, or with Arizal, or Baal Shem Tov, or whoever, what would they have to say? And that's what I did for around a year and a half, 2 years. And ultimately it changed my life. And I'll tell you what happened. For me, the experience was that I came to hear, for lack of a better way of putting it, the music of Judaism. And when you hear music, it's very different than just words. It resonated. And especially the spiritual part of it resonated. What I could not really relate very directly to was the detailed laws, which I grew up with. The Talmud is full of intricate arguments and hair splitting on every detail. Now I studied and I knew it, but it didn't inspire me. I almost saw it. I remember once even asking my teacher, this was considered irreverent. Why do we need to sit and study the Talmud? We hire lawyers to read mortgage statements and contracts and the fine print. Have any of you ever read a 90-page mortgage contract? I mean, maybe some people like to do it. Most don't. You hire people for that. And I remember this teacher was not very happy with what I said, and he said to me, "You're going to be a troublemaker." I think he was right. Maybe it was a blessing. So point being was, the soul, however, changed everything for me. It resonated. When you hear music, someone will say to you, "Prove to me that music touches you." You don't need proof. It's experiential proof. It touches your heart. It's not like if someone will hook you up to sensors and your heartbeat goes up and your blood pressure gets higher and your brain waves begin to get stimulated. That's proof that music touches you. I'm sure most of you don't need that to demonstrate that. Music touches you because it touches you. It's an experience. Now, obviously, experience has to be subject as well to some discretion because our emotions can be manipulated. We know that. But there's no greater proof than experience. When you experience it, someone will say, "How do you know children are beautiful?" Having children is beautiful. You'll say, "Well, my friend, you're going to have children, you'll find out." There's very hard ways of document it through scientific expressions or a feeling of love. So all real things in life actually are not subject to proofs. Because proof, as I said before, is a limited tool. The mind is great, but it's overrated a bit. Because the mind does not cannot account for most real human experiences, like love, which many people think is actually insane and not very rational. And same with other real experiences. You take words like truth, love, soul, God, and stuff like that, all those things are not really subject to the mind. That doesn't mean the mind can't somewhat analyze it, but it's not beginning and the end of the mind. The mind is a one aspect, one tool of our full human experience. So this is somewhat what informs me till this day, because I'm still a skeptic. I still maintain, when anyone says to me, prove to me God exists, I always laugh to myself. I say, I could give you some proofs, but I could also give you some proofs that God doesn't exist. They say, you're a rabbi. You're not supposed to be proving that God doesn't exist. I said, I'm being honest with you, that I think for every proof, there's always an argument the other way around. Because if there was really absolute proof, then 7.5 billion people on this planet would believe it, and they don't. So tell me why. Because there's also arguments against it, and so on. And I've actually became known in New York and by certain circles as the rabbi of atheists, because atheists seem to associate with me, honestly. I know it sounds weird, but I'll share with you. I give a weekly class for many years, since 1982, long before the war, all the wars, many wars, just an expression. Before many of you were born. That's a compliment. You all look so young to me. And in this class, a very diverse class of people from all backgrounds. A lot of interesting stories. I'll share a few more soon, but this one I want to share here is, so one day, it was like 40, 50 people come to the class. It still goes on. Now I do it mostly online because we're looking for a location in Manhattan, West Village, actually. That's happening shortly. But I do it online. The class is very well attended. Very many different interesting people come to it. Many people from the arts and entertainment industry and others. Really diverse to the point you'll have people there that are absolutely no background in Judaism. Even non-Jews as well attend. And so I remember one guy comes over to me after the class, and he says to me, his name was Matt, that, I really been coming to your classes the last few months. I really enjoy them. But I want to tell you, out of respect, that I am a full-fledged atheist. I have doubts. I'm not an agnostic. I really do not believe in God. Absolutely don't believe in God. So I said, okay. So, he was waiting for my reaction. I had no reaction. I said, and so I said, but you are here. I do talk about God from time to time, He says, your God I have no problem with. Exactly those words. So it reminded me immediately of the line from Lev Yitzchak Barditchev, who once told a self-proclaimed atheist, the God you don't believe in, I also don't believe in. Which, of course, is a tremendous line, because it tells you everything. We all talk and we debate, God, not God. Like anything, first start with a definition of terms before you have a debate. If I'll call a chair a table and you call it a chair, this debate will never go anywhere, because we're talking about two different realities. And he said to me, so your God I can accept. I have parents who I've been giving recordings of your classes to, and they're even more radical atheists than I am. I first got exposed then that there are levels in atheism, just like there's levels in belief. There's moderate atheism, the average, and radical. I mean it. I actually wrote a few articles about it afterwards. The same thing with agnosticism. And there's a whole American atheist society of America or something. And you'll see there's variations. And, we thought belief, there's levels. There's also levels there. So he says, my parents want to come next week. And they are very respectful people. My father's a psychiatrist. Arthur was his name. His mother was Estelle. And they are, my mother is an intellectual property attorney. They live in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. Are you from there? Anybody? No. Okay. And they want to come, but they want to also be respectful. They know that you're a rabbi, a teacher. And I should know that they are atheists. I mean, as soon as I heard this type of respect, I already started becoming skeptical of their atheism, if I may put it that way. No pun intended. And they came the next week, and they started coming whenever they were able. Months and months, and became good friends with them. I can tell you right now, without hesitation, that probably they're the two people with more faith and more God in their lives than many people that are called believers. They were so damn honest that for them they could not bring themselves to say they believe in God, because the God that they related to was completely illogical. And we would talk about it. I mean, I wasn't trying to, they would come to my class, I talked about God all the time. I didn't hide the word, but they had no issues. Anyway, over a year later, Arthur calls me. He'd like to take me out to dinner with his wife, and they want to talk to me about something. So we go to Prime Grill, kosher restaurant in Manhattan. Huh? Olav Shalom. Of blessed memory, yes. Yeah. There are always new ones that sprout up. So we go out to dinner, and Arthur looks at me and says to me, I want to consult with you. I'd like to begin putting on tefillin. And I want to know what you think. So I said, what does Estelle say? What does she was sitting there. It's a great idea. Okay, so what's the problem? I mean, you both agree. What do you need my advice for? He said, but I don't believe in God. I mean it. I said, so what? He says, how could I tefillin? The whole tefillin is only based on because God said so. It's not a man-made thing. So I said, do you want to put it on? So you put it on. He said, but I don't believe in God, so why would I do it? I said, first of all, you're asking me. You're the one that suggested it. I'm not telling you what to do. And he said, no, but I want to hear what your thoughts. So I said, look, Jews put on tefillin. You put on tefillin. He started crying like a baby. I mean it. He was like so moved. And he would remind me later. He said, you just said simple statement. Jews put on tefillin. And I want to be a Jew. That's what Jews do. But he was telling me he doesn't believe in God while he's saying it. Now, honestly, I didn't even argue with him. I didn't say how it's not consistent. How could you say you don't believe in God? You're putting on tefillin. I found it actually amusing, to be honest. But I didn't say anything because I respected him greatly. And I never even told him. I said to him, your honesty, I wish every God-fearing person I know was so honest and so real. So he didn't just start putting on tefillin. He came to Crown Heights and he bought the biggest tefillin possible. I don't know if you know, tefillin their sizes. This one was like the biggest. And he wanted the biggest. Then later I hear from his son that he's building himself a Jewish library in Cherry Hill. And he has hundreds of books getting delivered. Medrash. He's telling me he's reading every week the Medrash. And he keeps telling me he doesn't believe in God. Then they tell me that they started keeping Shabbos. So they have a mini Shabbos and a maxi Shabbos. Every 4 weeks it's a maxi Shabbos they call, where they do the whole thing, Friday night and Shabbos day. And the mini Shabbos is only Friday night. Anyway, it sounds exaggerated, I promise you. And then they aged. And I had this interesting relationship with them, and I told them the line from Belivitz and Batitchev, and they totally. I never really got the whole story, but I'm sure that both of them they were like high school sweethearts. They were married for 60 years, and they were in love. They were loyal to each other. I mean, everything you want from a person that is a person of God, they were. And I tell you, probably more than anyone I've ever met. I really mean that. Then Estelle passed away. She had cancer. And I remember Arthur telling me, I went to the Shiva call by him. He was already also aging. And he says to me, he's still the honest man. He says to me, I don't know if there's a heaven. But if there's a heaven, I'm sure Estelle is there. That's his words. And he passed away a few weeks later. They were so attached, he couldn't live without her, basically. So they asked me to say a few words at the funeral in Cherry Hill. And I did. And I said that story about the heaven, that if there's a heaven, he said Estelle is there. So I can tell you there is a heaven, and I'm sure Estelle and Arthur are up there in the front row. And they were really an inspiration to me in so many ways. And it brought to the fore an issue that I've always struggled with, which sometimes when I want to make some trouble, I pose to audiences, especially devout audiences, or I should qualify that, people who think they're devout. And I would ask, let me ask you a question, hypothetical. Here's a person, an individual, that is the kindest person, is kind and compassionate and giving, would not hurt anyone, would forego their own comfort if it's going to affect anyone else in a negative way. But that person claims they don't believe in God. And then another person considers themselves the most pious person and says they're God-fearing and they do every detail of every mitzvah and eat matzah and with every nuance. But when it comes to people, they're obnoxious and mistreat people and can even do things that are quite hurtful and abusive. What do you think about that? Who is the God-fearing person? And I can tell you, the more the religious the audience, the more it takes them they can't accept what I just said. And some of them will say it's impossible. I've heard that. They say it's impossible. I said, but I know the people. And I actually do, because I knew Arthur and Nostalgical. And some people just can't accept it. And I realized as a result that the truth is, if you really push, I don't want to push any boundaries here. I don't want to offend anybody, but it's all right. Whatever happens here stays here. Okay, good.
You're only casting your own opinion.
Right. I not that I really need your permission. I just wanted to make sure I don't offend anybody. But so I'm very disturbed by the whole word religious, frankly. Whenever I hear someone says to me, "Oh, you're a religious Jew," so I say, "Okay, a religious Jew." So what does that mean? There's a human being and there's a religious human being. As if religion is something else than human. It almost suggests that it's like not human. Where, from my point of view, a religious person, if you were to define it properly, would be even the most human possible person. The person who's the kindest person, the most refined person, the most evolved person, the most actualized person. So there are words, and words actually are traps. When it comes to religious matters, I can tell you as a communicator, as a writer, words are actually an enemy, because every religious word is filled and fraught with stereotypes. I mentioned before God. What does God really mean? Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Berditchev, as I said the God you don't believe in, I don't believe in. Which means, and behooves us to challenge us, what does God mean? If I would go around the room here, besides the prerequisite supreme being, first cause, creator, no two people would define God the same way once you have to personalize it. And where do we learn about God? They tell at home, in school. And so if we got a distorted version of God, that's our God. And if we got a better version, that's our God. And frankly, most people did not get a version altogether because they picked it up by default. No one ever gave a course and said, okay, let's define all definitions and come away, what is the Jewish definition of God? So they tell the joke about, I think I mentioned it the other day, about the bathroom scale. So there's a Hebrew school teacher giving Sunday classes to Jewish kids, boys and girls that are not going to any yeshiva. So their parents send them once a week to get a Hebrew class. So the beginning of the semester, the teacher turns to the students and says, let's find a point of reference. Anything in your house, in your life, that reminds you of God. Okay, so one point, a child mentioned a Star of David, a prayer shawl, a menorah, a matzah, cholent, whatever. One girl sitting in the class, nothing, she had nothing to say. Absolutely nothing. The teacher's pestering her, trying to find something. Nothing. You never hear the word God mentioned, never. And finally the girl says, yes, I do actually. And it's connected to a bathroom scale. What is that? That every time my mother steps on it, she yells out, oh my God. So there you have God. Now it's humorous and it is a joke, but also think of this: the child never hears any other expression of God. So what is God going to end up being? Some word we use when we feel uncomfortable. I don't know, maybe a curse even, like God damn it, if I may use that expression. Okay. So the point is that the word God, this three-letter word, which evokes so much. There are people who are passionate believers. They're even passionate, ready to die for it, and ready to kill others in the name of God. And then there are people who are passionate non-believers. As I said, radical atheists. Christopher Hitchens considered himself a radical atheist. And he wrote a book called God is Not Great. And what do you see in all these books? Richard Dawkins, another one. Sam Harris, who's also Jewish. Hitchens is Jewish, Harris is Jewish. I don't think Dawkins is, but he probably has some Jewish blood. As I said, you can't be an atheist like that unless you're Jewish. Yeah. So, what do they all have in common? When you read their definition of God, I get repulsed. I would be the same atheist like them if that's what God is like. For them, God is the God of religion that has terrorized the world for the last 2,000 years. Christians killing in the name of God. Muslims now killing in the name of Allah. And when they read the Bible, they see a God, a punitive God, that is busy punishing and angry and wrath and invoking and pouring his wrath over people. Then you hear the Holocaust. You say, oh God, the Jewish people, the chosen people. And what happens? Where did God go? These are your people, allowing 6 million, 1.5 million innocent children. How can you not have a crisis when you talk about God, when you see all this? So yes, there are the proofs and there are the arguments, but you have to deal with evil, and you have to deal with justice, and you have to deal with so many dilemmas. So you can be surprised that most of us are completely either confused, or end up being non-believers, or end up being more like agnostic. One day yes, one day not, maybe not. Now, I'm dealing with this, first of all, in my own personal life, because I actually have always struggled with the question. Not because I'm per se a non-believer, but I am per se a skeptic. And I've always seen the way God was presented was not a God I can associate with. So I did find my so-called definition, and I'll share it, of course, that's part of this conversation. I remember I was once on a radio show, it was on by phone, and it was about faith and matters like that. And the interviewer I saw was a real cynic, because he kept on he was trying to almost make fun of me, Rabbi, etc. But he did it wisely. So he says to me, he throws me out this question. He says to me, so tell me, Rabbi, do you ever have a crisis of faith? It's like almost like it was a Woody Allen movie, to be honest. How Woody Allen makes fun of the rabbis. So he says to me, do you ever have a crisis of faith? I've been on radio, and I learned how to deal with hecklers. So I decided I'm going to turn it around on him. So I said to him, yeah, every second of my life I have a crisis of faith. Because how can you not? If you believe in a good God, and you see injustices, you see killings, you see people, innocent people being hurt, how could you not have a crisis? And then I said to him, let me ask you something. Do you ever have a crisis? He says, I'm not a believer. So I said, so why should you, let me ask you this. So you probably think that religious people, faith for them is a crutch. They're imbeciles, they're primitive, they don't have a sophisticated understanding of life. So when something happens bad, they just say, oh my God, it's God, God, God. It's a crutch, it's easy way out, right? He says, yes, I do believe that. So I said, let me ask you something. Does it bother you when an innocent child gets killed in a car accident? Or 1.5 million innocent children were killed in the Holocaust? He said to me, yes, it bothers me. I said, why should it bother you? The world is not a fair world. Dog eats dog, survival of the fittest. Does it bother you when a predator kills the prey in the wild? It's not pleasant, but it's part of nature. That's how it is. Some people are more dominant than others. The Nazis were stronger than the Jews, and they killed them. Why do you expect justice if you don't believe in God? That's what I said to him. So you should be completely at peace with your life. You don't expect justice, so when there's injustice, there's no problem. He was flustered, I can tell you. He didn't know what to say. I said, I will tell you that people who believe in God believe in higher goodness. So they are disturbed when they see injustice. It bothers them greatly because they dedicate their lives to try to make the world a better place. So when they see something not proper, they are disturbed. And you know what? They argue with God about it. And they demand God. They pray to God. Prayer is not just acquiescing. It's arguing with God. All the men of women of faith all argued with God. Now, no one accepted God's plan. Look at Abraham. It's an unbelievable story in the Bible. Abraham was the man who discovered God. The Torah says this is maybe the only verse where God reveals to us his thoughts. He's about to kill the city of Sodom, which are wicked people, corrupt city, by all accounts. And God says to himself, should I tell Abraham about my plans? Now, what was God's doubt? Because he knew Abraham's going to give him a tough time. So the verse in the Torah says, I find this one of the most unbelievable verses. God says, Hamachasa anima Avram, am I going to conceal from Abraham my plans, a man, a man who dedicated his life not to self-interest, but to do tzedakah and mishpat, kindness, compassion, virtue, justice. A man like that, I'm going to hide my plans from. You think about that. That's what God is telling. And God tells Abraham. And what does Abraham do? He gives God a hard time. He says, how could you destroy a corrupt city? Maybe there's some innocent people there. 50, God says, find me 50. 40, 30, they can't find one. Now you think he's a man of faith. Finally, we always struggle with the dilemma that the wicked prosper. Here, finally, God's ready to punish the wicked. And what is that tzaddik like Abraham saying? No, you can't kill the infidels. Because maybe there's an innocent man there. And maybe you can find some merit. Because people of faith are not children. We're not talking about the naive faith of a 2-year-old. You're talking about sophisticated thinkers who realize faith is beyond the mind, not before the mind. That as much as you use your mind, there's always a door that it leads you to. And to enter that door, you need faith. And people like that, when they see an injustice, they will argue with God. Because God didn't create us as puppets and just accept whatever I say. So then you'll say, so what makes them people of faith if they argue with God? The answer is that once they do their arguing and they do everything they can, and God decides what God decides, they know they will accept it no matter what. Because at the end of the day, there is one God. But God wants us to argue. Moses in Egypt, when he sees Pharaoh bathing in the blood of Jewish children, this holiday that we honor, what does Moses say? Lama hiresa la'am hazeh. Why, you God, are you doing evil to this nation? And he's actually rebuked. God says to him, you know what? The forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, never spoke to me that way. They accepted my plans. I mean, the question is asked, what about Abraham and Sodom? But they never said those words. Abraham, the strongest statement he said was, you're the judge of the universe. People will say the judge of the universe is not doing justice. Here Moses points an accusing finger at God. He doesn't say you're allowing Pharaoh, Hitler to do this. He says, why are you doing evil? And this is the greatest man of faith, the man chosen by God, the humblest man that ever walked on earth, the man chosen by God, because that's exactly why he was chosen. Not to just accept whatever God says. We're partners with you, Moses was saying to God, and I am challenging you and demanding that you allow these people to free them. And this happens more than once. Moses does it even more. The whole Yom Kippur is based on that. Do you ever wonder why Yom Kippur is the holiest day of the year? Some people say, hey, one day got to be holy, so why not then, right? It's not the case. There's a reason. Because Yom Kippur is a particular day in the calendar that after the Jews received the Torah, which will be 49 days from second day of Passover, Shavuos, then 40 days Moses is up on the mountain, 40 days and 40 nights. He comes down. It's the 17th of Tammuz now, and he sees the Jews have built a golden calf. He breaks the tablets, and he marches back up on the mountain, and he argues with God to forgive the people. God says no. He spends 40 days, another 40 days. And God says no. He comes down on the first day of Elul. It's 40 days from the 17th of Tammuz, which is 40 days from Shavuos, which is 49 days from Passover. It's all a structure. And he goes up on the first of Elul a third time. And this time he prevails. And what's 40 days from the first of Elul? Yom Kippur. 30 days of Elul and 10 days of Tishrei. It's the 10th of Tishrei. Moses comes down with a second set of tablets. Salachti kidvarecha, God says, I've forgiven them as you've asked. But God didn't give him an easy time. It took 80 days to receive forgiveness, only 40 days to receive the law. So it's one of the big mysteries. What did Moses say? How did he change God's mind, so to speak? He basically was saying that you created these people. They're flawed, like all of us are. And you need to give me a back door when they make a mistake. They have to have hope. Essentially, Yom Kippur is the birth of hope. And God responded to Moses. I'm paraphrasing, but this is what's alluded to in their dialogue, which is a chapter in the Torah, Parsha Kisisa. And God says to them, what should I do? They're the ones that betrayed me. I said, don't build golden calf. Don't have false gods. 39 days later, there they go. Days. The people that just heard the 10 of the 10 commandments. They built the golden calf. They basically betrayed me. What do you want me to do? And there's rules in existence. When you put your hand in fire, fire doesn't punish you. It's cause and effect. The fire will burn. They basically committed spiritual adultery in a sense. They chose another God. So there's rules in existence. So Moses says to God, again paraphrasing, yeah, but you created the rules. But I don't break the rules. But I'm asking you, I'm not going to build another nation, which is what God suggested, because another nation will also make mistakes. And we'll be back to the same place. I need you to tell me that I can tell the people that no matter what happens, that even if they break a promise, even if there is a betrayal, a loss, anything, they need to have, there's a back door, that if they do tshuva, if they show that they are interested, that you will let them back in. And that finally prevailed, and God said, you're right, I forgive them as you've requested. Here are the second tablets. Now, of course, you could say, 1 second, God didn't know that he would agree. What did he need to put Moses through all of this? Because that's the mystery of our relationship with God. There's a partnership. And as much as we don't understand free will, and we don't understand how God could allow a Holocaust, and I'm not here to even try to explain it, one thing we know is that we're partners, and as partners we have a right, an obligation to challenge God. God ultimately will have the final say, obviously. Do you remember the story with Mrs. Waxman in Israel? Her son was in the IDF, and he was captured by the Hamas, and they wanted, of course, 2,000 terrorists or whatever released. Israel wouldn't negotiate with them, but they were playing the game as if they were. All of Israel was praying with Mrs. Waxman for her son. Now, usually Israel figures out a way, and they almost did free him. They found out where he was, but they came a minute too late. And he was killed. They killed him right there. So, it was headlines. It was like, 15 years ago? Anyone remember? So one of these abrasive Israeli journalists says to Mrs. Waxman, when she was sitting shiva for her son, I don't know how anyone can say that to a child, to a mother that just lost her child. So what happened to all your prayers? Like, and the whole nation was praying with you. And she calmly, full composure, said to him, I prayed, and God listened, and God said no. That was her response. She put him in his place, but it was like, awesome to hear that. And this was not some cute line, some mother sitting shiva for her son. But that is ultimate faith. It's not rational, but it's not irrational. It's super rational. And going back to what we were talking about earlier, the point, I was talking about the radio show, the language is the biggest issue. The language is the issue. The whole discussion about atheism, agnosticism, faith, is all about language from my point of view. Because, let's take an example. Here we have a beautiful hotel, a beautiful, what would this room be called? Okay. Now, would anyone here, in their rational mind, say that this built itself, this room, or this hotel, or this Pesach program and all that food, that it just happened? No one would say that, because anything designed dictates that there's a designer. A book dictates there's an author. Beautiful symphony, that there's a composer. A building, there's an architect. A piece of art is an artist. So how is it possible that we can say that this universe, which is so beautifully designed, nicer, more beautiful, infinitely more than any art, music, structures, architecture, just look at the human eye, take one detail of existence, and let alone all of it, and say, no, there has no designer. When I was younger and I heard this proof, it actually didn't impress me. For some reason, I dismissed it. As I got older, I used to say to myself, you know what? It's a really solid proof. What is the argument against it? So you ask scientists, and I've talked to many scientists, they'll say the following. They'll say, I'm not saying there's no God. We don't need God, basically. Because we can explain through evolution and through natural selection how everything has evolved to where it is today from that first ball of gas. I say, but what about who put that first ball of gas? That's outside of the domain of science. That's what honest scientists say. Some will say, no, there is no God, whatever. But an honest one will say, it doesn't matter. You know the story of Chelem. I think I gave a talk about this, Yom Tov. Maybe not, because I remember some of my jokes. If I did, you remind me. Anyway, the guy from Chelem, Chelem was this little town in Poland. And he comes out to the big city, and it was in the late 19th century, and he suddenly sees something that he never saw before. He saw vehicles that are moving without a horse pulling them, called a steam locomotive. And he's so in shock. He comes back to his town, he can't wait to tell them. He says, in the big city, in Vilna or wherever, there's these vehicles, and there's no horse pulling them, and they're moving. So they ask him, how are they moving then? He says, there's a vehicle behind it, pushing it. So, and they say, what about who's pushing that second vehicle? A third vehicle, and a fourth vehicle. What about the last vehicle? He says, I forgot to ask. It's a technicality. Because he couldn't imagine how a vehicle would move. So, that's what many scientists will say. I've talked to scientists very bluntly about this. So I say, I have to ask you a question. I've developed a theory like this. The reason I think most of us, or let's put it this, non-believers, don't accept the designer argument that I just mentioned is for the following reason, because there's consequences. The fact that someone built this building, who cares? So to say an architect, big thing. But if someone says that life and existence was created by a creator, that means you and I were also created by the creator. 1 second. That may mean I'm accountable. That may mean I'm responsible. And there, our subjective interests and biases say, 1 second, maybe there is no God. That was the theory I developed. So I asked this to scientists. I say, I know you dismiss religious people as being biased and prejudiced and narrow-minded and whatever. Okay? But let me ask you, as a scientist that's an open-minded person, we all know that in science you need transparency. And you need to demonstrate if you have any self-interest. You need to recuse yourself if you have interest. As a scientist, you have to begin with one statement. Before I talk about God, I have to say, I prefer the result that there is no God because then I don't have to be accountable. I've never met a scientist that's ready to accept that. They say, no, we're objective. I say, you're not objective because you have vested interest in the result that there's no God just as much as a religious person has vested interest that there is a God. And you don't tell me anything. I also don't want to be accountable. I'm just like you. I realize the importance of being accountable. But of course, we all would rather not be accountable. If someone suddenly tells me that my life is controlled by some higher power and I'm responsible, of course I'll be skeptical. Why would I suddenly just buy into it? Then I finally found one thing I must admit. Aldous Huxley, thinker, philosopher, Brave New World. Guy got into psychedelics and he chose to leave this world on an acid trip. So he died, I think, in 1962 or something like that. 63?
The same day that Kennedy was assassinated.
Really?
Yes, same day.
November 22nd.
Yep.
Okay.
And same day as Lewis, the other author. All three of them died the same day.
You never know who's in the audience. What was the Jewish day in the calendar?
I'll tell you in 2 seconds.
So it's Hanukkah? Huh? No, November. Okay.
November 22nd.
It's all right. It doesn't matter.
Well, I know the day, that's for sure. November 22nd, 1962.
C.S. Lewis also died that same day. C.S. Lewis also died the same day.
Okay.
C.S. Lewis, Aldous Huxley, and JFK.
Okay. So Aldous Huxley, I once shared this thought about scientists being biased and objective. Aldous Huxley, to his credit, he I think coined the word agnostic, by the way. He writes, I have it if you want to see the text, and I was quite taken by it. He writes, I have lived my life without a God, and I make my arguments against God. However, as an honest person, I have to state my opening disclaimer is I have vested interest in this conclusion. Because I want to live my life the way I want to live it, especially in the sexual arena. That's what he writes. So that to me was the first time I saw somebody at least saying that. You know what? Fine. You may not agree with him. He decides he's going to live the way he wants to live. We're not going to get into that argument, but at least he stated it. So I came to realize, you know what? This whole thing with God, if you want real rational arguments and no biases, the designer argument is as good as it gets. And yet, even people who are believers, let's go the other way around. And I always say, you're a real believer, right? Is it possible for you to do something that God said not to do? Of course. So I said, if God is with you 24/7, how is it possible? You know, if you're such a believer. So you can have believers who are not doing what God wants, and you can have non-believers who are doing what God wants, as I described in the story on the opening of my talk. So you start thinking that way, you start realizing you got to go redefine all these words. What does it even mean? As I said, my father passed away around 14 years ago. So me and my mother traveled to Israel. They were meeting relatives that year. A woman came to see us in the hotel. My father was a journalist. I mentioned, I think, in a previous talk that he was a colleague of Elie Wiesel's, and he was for 12 years, the correspondent Yediot Achronot of the largest Israeli daily. She was a correspondent in New York of Ma'ariv, which was the second largest daily. So she came to see us and just extend her condolences. She was already an older woman, like something in her 70s. And she says she'll never forget the first time she met my father. She's telling us, it was 1961 at the White House, talk about JFK, and there was a press conference, and she sees my father. It was her first assignment. It was his first assignment. And she sees a beard, a yarmulke. She goes over to him. She's telling this to us in Hebrew. And I was this really chutzpahdik, abrasive Israeli, young woman, journalist. I thought I was like the smartest person on earth. And I said to your father, you know, I just want to know, I see that we're both going to be on the circuit here, journalists here in New York and Washington. I just want you to know I hate religious Jews. You know, Israelis need to say that. They need to be open. They tell you the way it is. So my father told her the following. He says he wasn't fazed. He didn't even turn away. He just looked at her. He smiled. And he said, if you knew my father, he was a very composed, very patient. And he says to her, let me ask you something. You visit the sick? Yeah. You honor your parents? Yeah. You give charity? Yeah. You know, you're more religious than I am. That's what my father tells her. And she suddenly realized what kind of fool she is. She decided, what's religion? Because he's wearing a beard and a yarmulke? That's religion. Religion is how you behave, how you live your life. You can have a person who's dressed in all the garments, and they live a life that's completely antithetical to God and everything God wants. And you can have a person that's completely, seemingly says, I have no God in my life, and they're the kindest person on earth. And she said it changed her way of thinking. You know, she was so embarrassed. She apologized, of course. I thought it was a great answer. I thought to myself many times, if someone told that to me, I'd say, it's all right, you know, we'll get along anyway. But my father had an even better answer. Fine. So, language. So let's talk now about language, so how then do you define God? So I always share this story because to me it's the best story that captures this. I mentioned before the weekly class I give, I'm still giving till this day. In the early years of the class, it was the core group were people from the arts and entertainment industry. I can drop some names if you like. If I don't impress you with what I say, I may have to drop some names. Okay, that's what we do, you know. I was sitting in this class, people, as I said, mostly Jews, very spiritual, musical-oriented, artsy, bohemians. However, it came from a different place where they were not traditional at all. Most of them, the classic American story of Jews, bar mitzvah, bat mitzvah, ended it all. And Judaism was a joke, the jokes of Woody Allen, literally. You know, where I have to tell two of them, if I may. There's two guys get lost in a hot air balloon, and they don't know where they are. They're looking around, they yell down below, and they see a guy below, where are we? And he says, you're in a hot air balloon. A gust of wind comes by, whisks them away, and they're back to square one. So one guy says to the next, what was that? He says, that was definitely a rabbi. How do you know? Because what he said was true but irrelevant. You know? I've told this joke many times in America, and from the volume of the laughter, you know who you're speaking to, because people have this experience. He's a nice guy, but he's irrelevant, you know. And then there's that Woody Allen one, which also is really biting, and it's very anti-Semitic, frankly, but it's a good joke. What can I tell you? So,
Why wasted?
yeah, right. Why waste it on the anti-Semites? I could share it among friends. So this guy comes to the rabbi and says, Rabbi, I hear the Torah has the secret to all truth. Yes. Will you teach it to me? Sure. How much will it cost? He says, how could I charge you? God didn't charge Moses. Moses didn't charge the people. It's free. So he's doubly impressed. He's getting the secrets as well as for free. They sit down. Of course, this is a Woody Allen. So you imagine the punchline is a little different. So they sit down. They start opening up a Torah. It's all in Hebrew. The rabbi says Hebrew lessons will be $20,000. Okay, so somewhere there's a catch. This is it. So these jokes, of course, resonate with most American Jews because they had actual experiences like this. And every joke has some truth to it because it means that that's really what people experience. So here I was sitting with a group of people who probably had, remember that movie that the Coen brothers made? What was it called? The Ordinary Man, about a Jewish satire, hilarious. But it was so tragic because it's Serious Man, right? It's painful to see, but it's hilarious. Yeah. I don't need to know when it was released. It's not relevant to this discussion. Okay, so here I am sitting with a group of people, and I wanted to obviously communicate with them well. Their background, they would say their spirituality came more from music, from Zen Buddhism, from LSD, and stuff like that. Okay, so I decided to try an experiment because I realized, but even before I opened my mouth, I'm at a disadvantage. I don't project a neutral image. Here I am, a beard, a yarmulke, and I may remind some of them of an irrelevant rabbi, or of a grandfather that schlepped them to the Seder or to Yom Kippur, and against their will. Or even if it's positive memories, it was definitely not neutral. So I decided, you know what? Before I say anything, let me use a language that's not loaded with religious terms. And I decided I won't use any words in Hebrew, no Torah words, no Jewish words, completely new language. So what did I do? Instead of God, I spoke about a higher reality, or the essence of it all. And if it was a particularly New Age group, I said things like undefined layers of unconscious energy or something like that, Yeah. Instead of Torah, I used the word blueprint. Instead of mitzvahs, connections. Instead of Mashiach, Geula, redemption, I used destination. And here I was waxing eloquent and pontificating about how you reach the essence of all reality that is within it all, and we follow a blueprint and make the connections until we came to a point, the destination, where there's a total seamless fusion between matter and energy, form and function, body and soul, inner and outer, the surface and what lies beneath it. Basically, the world of indeterminism and the world of determinism. And they were sitting there, I could tell you, they were like, wow, this is great stuff. I could say they were even mesmerized. And I was like, it was going great. Week after week, I was discussing it. I used everything that comes from Torah, but I just never used the language. It was all about a higher reality and about connecting it to our lower reality and making it all fuse together, aligning it to the point where there's a complete fusion between materialism and spirituality, body and soul. After a few weeks, a guy comes over to me. His name was Kenny Vance was his name. He was actually a singer in the group called Jay and the Americans, or a rock group in the 60s. Yeah. Jay Black was yet another Jew who actually studied cantorial lessons by Kosovitsky, the great Chazan. Yeah. That's why you'll see some of his songs are very cantorial-like. So Kenny Vance comes over to me, and before the class, he says to me, "Are you talking about God?" I mean, so there my cover was blown, and I said, "Yes, but shh, don't spoil it for the others, Don't spoil it for the others." But what I learned from that was experiment worked beyond my expectation, how much language is so vital. especially when it comes to these matters, because you don't even know, each of you, and I don't even know. Words can mean innocuous word I can use, but when you hear it, it reminds you of some word your mother used every time she was angry. Words are loaded. So we live in an age where we communicate, and they say break the silence, and your spouse doesn't know what you're thinking. Don't hold it back. Express yourself. To the point that we talk too much maybe today. But communication also has a downside, words. What words are you using? I always tell couples, when I counsel couples, I say, sometimes just use different words. You can say exactly the same thing. It's not what you say, it's how you say it. Because words are loaded. They're trapped. They're trappings. And they can end up turning us off because simply the word itself. And that's why many times I won't use the word God if I'm in certain environments. Or I'll explain it with these qualifications. And people don't even realize, we don't even realize how much we stereotype without any malicious intention. So when you start talking about, I did meet Woody Allen, by the way, because he knew some of the people that came to my class. And I tried to convey this to him. He was so far off and he was already into his own world. He didn't accept it. He said, how do I know that's not another conspiracy? The language. I said, I'm not trying to sell it to you. Look into it. But my point was simply made that we build stereotypes and images and preconceived notions, and then it becomes very difficult to break them. And around religion, absolutely. The statistic is that over 90% of Americans believe in some form of God and spirituality, but only 40% associate with a religion. That's not a small discrepancy. The reason is very simple. Religion and spirituality are not seen as synonymous. They're actually seen as, what's the opposite of synonymous? Antonymous? As opposites. Ask people. People will say the more religious someone is, the less spiritual they are. The more spiritual, the less religious. I know it sounds odd. Religion is associated with these words. And I've tested this. Knee-jerk, words, free association. Words like ritual, tradition, community, prayer, synagogue, holidays. They're not bad words, but that's what religion is associated with. If you take it a little further, religion is associated for many with fear, with anger, with judgment, with condescension, divisiveness. That's a fact. When you say the word spirituality, you'll always see a smile. People say spirituality, music, free-spiritedness, transcendence. So the fact of the matter is, anyone that studies Judaism properly knows, as the Zohar says, there's a body of Judaism, there's a soul of Judaism. The body is very didactic, it's very technical. The laws of Passover, the laws of Shabbos, the laws of kosher, detail. The soul, however, is the spirit, and the spirit lifts you to another place. So imagine only growing up with the Judaism, only the body of Judaism without the soul. What is it going to feel like? What's a body without a soul? I don't want to say the word. It's a corpse. It's dead. Now, the soul needs a body as well. A soul can float away and not be grounded and not be structured. So Judaism really is a fusion of body and soul. But the soul is what's most unknown. And when you don't understand the soul or don't know the soul, Judaism is rendered into a religion that's just about laws, which I don't understand, most of them, maybe the ethical ones, and it definitely does not uplift me. And that, unfortunately, is what many, many people experience. Now, some are people who grew up in traditional homes. They don't have the courage to break away because there is a lot of peer pressure and there's a lot of communal pressure to just fit in. And it's very difficult to break away from your family and from your community because they have a hold on you. And I know many that suffer in that world, and as well as maybe even live dual lives. They have the world that I know people have told me, my body and my dress and my behavior belongs to my family, but my soul and my mind belongs to the Greek philosophers. I've heard people tell this to me. And then there are those that do break away, and there are those, most of the Jews were never exposed to either of them, the body or the soul. So we have ourselves somewhat of a crisis on our hands, you can put it this way. But to me, the good news is, it's all based on lack of information. I'm not suggesting that's good, but when lack of information means the absence of knowledge. Because when you do present God in the proper way, and yes, like a higher reality, and yes, that goodness and the kindness is the most human and most Jewish thing you can do. When I ask religious Jews, tell me, what's the most important mitzvah in Judaism? Very few say the real one. The only is Avos Yisrael. V'ahavta l'recha kamocha, to love another. That's what Hillel said. Love another. Don't do to others that you don't like done to yourself. Is the whole Torah. Everything else is commentary. Rabbi Akiva said, "Ahavta l'recha kamocha." Love your fellow as yourself. Is that klal gadol b'Torah, the fundamental principle. There are people who clothing, garments, and even the color of their yarmulke is more important than that mitzvah. That's another tragedy. That just shows you this distortion, how we can focus on a complete detail. I remember once sitting at a meeting. I hate meetings, but this meeting I was forced to be there. They were talking about some leaders were trying to plan the future, of the dilemmas of some Jewish communities. And I remember one guy, I was just sitting there frustrated, but one guy gets up and says, all these proposals everyone's put on the table reminds me of that statement where they said they're arguing how to rearrange the deck chairs on the Titanic. Like who's going to sit in Mizrach, who's going to sit in the front. The Titanic is going down. So you can talk about a pimple on someone's nose when they have, God forbid, cancer. So there's a lot of distortion. And I'm really not here to badmouth or to be critical, but I have a point I want to make. That the solution really is not to go to the symptoms, but to the root. And the root is define God, define Torah, define it the right way, and you'll have millions of people embracing it. I have not even a doubt about it. Now, you have to get over the stereotypes. Marketing is a big issue when people already have a negative image. I know people who tell me, no way that I will ever be an observant Jew. I can't follow these rules. And my goal isn't even to make them an observant Jew. I said, just be open to hear a perspective on Torah you may never have heard. Now, some people are open to it. Many are not. Many refuse. Many people you'll not see in a synagogue, no matter what. They will not come to a Jewish environment. They're so far off, either because they've been burned and turned off by it, or because they never heard anything relevant in the first place. So for me, this is one of my big challenges. In a way, it's my mission in life, is how to inspire and how to maybe disarm, if you wish, and present ideas that are Torah-based in language that people can listen to. So I wrote Torah Meaning for Life. Was one of my objectives, was that. It's a book that is read by people from all walks of life. So are you familiar with it? Jews and non-Jews, because it's stripped from Hebrew and stripped from Jewish concepts as per se in the original language. It's just the idea. It's the spirit of the idea. It's the universal message of a mitzvah, if you want to put it that way, without any language that would be either prohibitive or misunderstood or misinterpreted. Now, it's not meant to manipulate. It's not meant to deceive. I say it up front in my introduction. I just know that's the way. I remember it was once at a book signing, and a woman comes and has 11 books. She wants me to sign them all. And then she whispers to me, I'm going to have to tear off the covers of some of these books. Because it says, Torah Meaning for Life, the wisdom of the Rebbe. And she said, certain friends of mine would not open the book if it says anything Jewish. And I said, tell me how it works out. And she did. She wrote to me a few months later that there were a few people who read the book. They never saw the cover. She told them she got a book, whatever it is. And then they said, where's it from? And she showed them, and they were shocked. I must share this story. This is a little, I'll tell you this story. Where are we time-wise here? I know it's not lunch yet, that I know. But is there anything else happening now, food-wise? 12? Okay. So, any of you from Cleveland? Everyone? So when the book was published, Torah Meaning for Life, a lot of what I share here is real experiences I had on the ground, in the field. Because I was speaking in bookstores. In bookstores, you meet people who don't go to synagogues or JCCs or other Jewish environments. So you meet anybody. And people sometimes didn't even come to hear me. They came to buy an auto repair manual or get a coffee. So it was very fascinating, the interactions I had. Now, when they send you on a book tour, it was originally 30 cities, and then it turned to 90 cities because they were very successful events. A lot of people were coming out. So the process is, you come there, the publisher sets you up, you have print interviews and radio interviews and television interviews, and then in the evening, there's the book signing. You speak, and then you sit down and you sign books. So that morning, it was in Cleveland, I was scheduled with an interview in what they call the morning drive book interviews. It's like a 6-minute interview on a couch with a what do they call them? An anchor person. Yeah. I walk in, because you come like 15, 20 minutes earlier. They set you up with a mic and all that. It's live. And I walk in, the woman that was going to interview me literally almost faints. I see, she turned all white, and she's like literally shocked to see me. I had no idea if I did anything or what. So I said, what's disturbing you? Your book is one of my favorite books. I love it. It's on my night table. And I never thought that the author would look like you. I promise. She didn't even realize that. Some people would take that as an insult, right? So I said, what do you expect me to look like? I'll tell you what she said. I just can't control myself. She says to me, I expected, based on the book, a tall, slim, clean-shaven guy. It's a sexy-looking guy. That's what she tells me. So I said to her,
Next slide.
not exactly a young lady, okay? So I said to her, I thought I was that. Maybe 2 out of the 3.
Now, in the next slide.
Anyway, so I said to her, anyway, it was quite funny. So I said to her, you know what? We can talk about that. That's a great topic. Yeah, that's what she said. It was good. I actually was so touched by it in a way. Then I realized maybe I shouldn't always show my face. Have more impact. So we sit down, and she asked the question in a much more, more diplomatic way. She says, "Wouldn't your message be received much better if you looked like one of us?" That's what she said, meaning more secular. So of course I had what to say. I said to her, "Would you say the same thing to a Saudi Arabian prince wearing the whole stuff, or to someone in dreadlocks from Jamaica?" Or other different garb that people wear? I don't think you would, because you'd be fired probably, So I'm not insulted, but I'll tell you this: your reaction is, I'm sure, the reaction of many people, and my response is maybe this is a good opportunity for us to get to know each other beyond the surface. Would you like me to judge you by your face and by your outer experience? This is who I am. I'm very comfortable in my own skin. I'm comfortable to dress this way. I'm comfortable with my yarmulke. Let's talk about the soul. That's the whole point of this book. That's the way it went. It was actually very good. I like that because she asked a good question. It's a question many people have. I'd rather be asked than to be avoided. So I deal with this a lot. Because a lot of times I'll meet people and they say, they get to know me, they say, "You're not the typical religious Jew. Religious Jew, they're thieves, they're this and that. You're an exception." That's what they tell me. I said, I appreciate your compliment, but it's not really true. There may be people that are criminals, but they're not necessarily living up to the standard of Judaism. We have a doctrine, we have a constitution. That's what you have to look at, not at people. There are many Americans doing things that are not exactly in American spirit. And the same thing here. I try to live up to those standards, but it's not me per se. It's 3,500 years almost of history of people who dedicated their lives and committed their lives and gave their lives for spiritual growth, for refinement, for changing this world, for fighting against the odds. That even when the world was a pagan, selfish world, they stood up against the tide and gave their lives and dedicated to kindness. And they ultimately changed the world. So when people hear that, it changes the whole picture. I mean, I can go on and on, to be really honest. I didn't even get into the topic of how we look at non-Jews, the stereotypes around that, which I find to be repulsive. God created every human being on this earth, 7.5 billion people. Even if the Jews have a special destiny, that doesn't mean that other people don't. But the fact is, we are living on the defense for 2,000 years. We were massacred, we were killed, and frankly, for many Jews, every non-Jew is a potential Nazi. I mean, they don't say it, but when are they going to come and round us up again? But there's also the whole other approach where God sent us many freedoms today and many blessings. And even though there's anti-Semitism, but we were a people that never retreated in fear. We always took the bull by the horns. We were among the Egyptians and we were among the Romans, and we're among the Persians, and among the Babylonians, and we prevailed. They are no longer around. Their empires are gone, and we are here. So that's a big lesson, that we have a message that will ultimately has ultimately changed the world, and will ultimately bring it to its fruition. As I said before, the destination. I won't use the Hebrew word, that may be a stereotype. So I'll use the destination of the total fusion of a material world. And this is actually a real expression, where God will return to his garden, and this universe will be a divine home for God. So, thank you so much. Okay. I would love to hear some nightmares of yours about religion and God. I always love that part. Okay.
I like to think of God as some superior creature that gave us Jews a very fortunate thing. He gave us a cooking book. A book of cooking.
It's not a good place to talk about cooking around here.
We can cook our behavior, our emotions, and our thoughts into a behavior, into a pattern which will give us the love your neighbor. That you have to do these things that are given in this cookie book. And women will appreciate that, because women like to look at books of cooking, right?
Hey, one second. This is very sexist here. Some men like to cook. I think that man there is no? Okay, not him. Let's point this out. You like to eat? Okay. Okay, 1 out of 2.
In that cooking book, it tells you what will happen. If you follow the cooking directions, it tells you the plus things, and if you don't, it tells you the minus things, which includes the Holocaust, by the way.
Yeah, I like what you said, because if 8 people see an automobile accident, and they really see it, I mean, it's not some, and they're asked to describe what they saw, not one description will be the same, because they're saying words are an enemy, because the words I use might not be the words that you use, and the words that he reads won't be the words that I meant. So the
Right.
idea is to get beyond the words. I don't have to tell you. The minute I tell you who God is in my own words, I have limited him. I have taken something away from him. You know, the common word today I keep hearing is social justice. Like I said, justice is a beautiful word. Don't mess with it. The minute you put an adjective in front of a noun, you limit the noun. And that's a bad, you said something else. You don't mean justice anymore. And I think the minute we try to describe God, we miss it. It automatically goes off. And I think what you were saying was so very real to me. It really put it together very nicely, and I appreciate it.
Thank you. That's kind of you. Thank you.
Question for you. Would you discuss, before we read about the 10 martyrs and how the angels cry out to Hashem, needs to be quiet or I'll destroy the universe. Would you tie that into what you said in the early part of your comments today?
Yeah, I'll repeat the question. Did you hear it?
No.
The story about the 10 martyrs that we read about in the Yom Kippur prayer, where the angels cry to God, this is Torah and this is the reward. I mean, these were the 10 greatest sages of the time, and the cruel Roman emperor decided to not just kill them, but kill them in a barbaric way. And we read this, we remember them. And of course, that big question that they ask, how could God allow such a thing? This goes to the question that we all have about any evil in the universe. And of course, most recently, the Holocaust. It wasn't 10 martyrs, it was 6 million. And we don't have an answer. God does not give us an answer. The best answer he gives there is be quiet. Be still. This is what arose in my will, and if you continue speaking, I'll destroy the universe. I'll talk about that in a moment. Because ultimately, when it comes down to good and evil, and really deserves its own discussion, but I'll just say briefly, we are not God, and we will never understand God's mysterious ways. As I said earlier, we don't accept evil. We don't just lie down and say, whatever you do to us, great. Someone's, God forbid, in the hospital, we pray for them. We beseech God, we say Misha Berachs, we give charity, we do whatever we can to change the decree. Why don't we just say, we're people of faith, The person's in the hospital. There's a reason God wants them there. We don't speak that way. Because God gave us intelligence and gave us feelings and said, do whatever you can to save a life. And don't just say, it's up to me. At the end of the day, however, the hidden choreography of life, both individual life, what we will go through in our lives, we have no idea. Who knows what tomorrow brings? This is a higher hand that's not in our control. And it's not meant to diminish us. It's meant actually to lift us up, to realize that if God is God, there is a plan. Now, we have free will and choice what we're going to do, what happens. And God should bless us all. We should have beautiful lives and not have to deal with any setbacks. But who in life is not having a setback? Who does not have a loss, a death? And sometimes, unfortunately, a painful one. So we always pray that the trauma should be minimal. But we also know that life is not controlled by us. And sometimes when you look back, you understand things that you could not understand at the time. You may understand maybe I had to grow a certain way. It was only possible going through a very difficult approach. Many people who've gone through suffering will say that. Not everybody. Some people get broken. But as we spoke about yesterday, like Viktor Frankl, Man's Search of Meaning, when you have meaning and purpose and you realize there's a deeper purpose to life, you never say, I'm smarter than God, because we're not. Because if there was no death, one of the best answers I've ever heard when God says to Job, he says to him, when Job says, why are you allowing such suffering of me, of other innocent people? God says to him, and I'm paraphrasing a bit, he says, were you there that when I created the universe that you could ask me that question? In other words, he's saying like this, you ask me why there's death. Do you ask me why there's birth? You ask me why there's life. Do you ask me why, you ask me why there's pain? Do you ask me why there's life? Remember, if there was no existence, there'd be no pain. But no one ever asks that question. Why are we here? And why do I have so many blessings in my life? We only ask when it's not working, when there's pain. Now, that doesn't mean we don't have a right to ask, but we should be humbled and realize that we ask when we're uncomfortable. And we don't know, because the same answer, why there's death, it will answer also, why there's birth will answer why there's death. And why is there joy will answer why there's pain. There's deeper purpose to it all, and those of us that embrace that don't become lesser people, we become greater people. Because I said earlier, there are things that are rational, there are things that the heart and the mind can somewhat contain, and there are things that we cannot. And sometimes the only answer is silence and tears. That's why we don't try to explain away the Holocaust, we don't try to explain away any death. Someone, God forbid, is sitting Shiva, hold their hand, cry with them, like one Rebbe once said, I don't have answers for you, but I can cry with you. That's basically what God was saying. He was not dismissing their question. He was saying silence is the best answer. I think it was the old Belzer Rebbe said that even if someone wanted to explain to me why God brought the Holocaust, I wouldn't want to hear. What do you think? I want to hear why God did it? That's going to make it easier? That'll make it harder. So it's the mystery of existence that we embrace. It's a certain sense of awe and unknown, and sometimes it's not exactly as we like it, but we do believe firmly that the end of the story will be good. Because I received an email from a woman who lost her husband at a young age with a bunch of little kids. And she wrote me, she signs the email like this: In the end, all will be good. If it's not good, it means it's not the end. And she's coming from a place of not just a bumper sticker, it's from her heart. And look what happened. Today we are after the Holocaust. No one could have imagined, I think in 1945, when you saw the devastation, that we would ever be able to rebuild after that. Just think about it. It wasn't one person. It was everybody. Everybody was affected. And here we are, a renaissance of Jewish life in Israel, in Russia, in America, wherever you turn. Do we have our challenges? We do. Now, if this was once, you could say, it's a fluke. But this happened to us time and again. We're compared to the moon. Just as it wanes and it's about to disappear, it's reborn again. It happened to us in Egypt, 210 years in God-forsaken Egypt. It happened to us with the Romans, and before that the Babylonians, every empire. And here we are. We said it, right? Every generation they tried to destroy us. Vihi, the promise, or the faith. It's feminine, vihi, withstood it all. So the answer is, we will prevail no matter what. Sometimes it comes very pleasantly, and sometimes we have to go through some twists and turns, and that's part of it, and we embrace it, and we move on, and we build, We don't get broken or demoralized. And we could say to God, even when we were not treated well, we continue to maintain belief that good will prevail. That's the ultimate statement of dignity that a human being can make.
Can you tie it together with the argument? And you mentioned, Moshe argued with him, Abraham argued with him. The angels were trying to argue with Hashem, and he just shut them up.
I just spoke for 10 minutes that he didn't shut them up. He told them the best possible answer that one can give. That silence is the most respectful answer in face of such pain.
But he didn't allow them to argue.
We argue all of history. We argue. And then God can say to you, be silent. He's entitled to do that. I mean, remember, it's a two-way statement, two-way discussion.
Can angels argue? I thought they were,
Okay,
they didn't have free choice.
that's a discussion. I don't want to go into a whole Talmudic debate about that, but yeah, that's another point you can make. Go ahead.
You mentioned earlier about being agnostic and scientists that you've spoken to who got to a point where they say, we don't need God, we can explain everything, except at the very beginning, we don't really quite know yet. Why do we have such a hard time with that? Why can't we just leave it at that? Why is it necessarily the right answer to say that everything else has a design, therefore the world and creation must have a design as well, otherwise it doesn't make sense? Why is the answer, I don't know? How come we can't be complacent there? Understanding that that's very difficult. Why do we have such a hard time? Therefore, if we don't know, there must be a God. I understand everything else you said. I know we just give a lot of time, but we seem to everyone sort of get stuck right there, and then we have to move on to the next part. Maybe that's the big part.
Well, the designer argument is really not based on faith. It's based on logic. That every design dictates a designer. So a book has to have an author. So a universe like this has to have a form of a designer. Call it whatever you want to call it. You don't want to call it God, call it a cosmic engineer. Now, faith would come into play if you want to understand this God. Like, for example, of course, all the atheists make the argument, if the universe needs a creator, then who's the creator of the creator? Who created God? So there you need to go into a discussion that God is very different than all of existence. And then there's definitely levels where you need faith, or you need to extrapolate, I should say, because you can't have a direct understanding of things. I mean, I'm not sure, I don't understand your question completely. Like, who says you have to go anywhere? I mean, I'm not sure, can you rephrase what you're asking?
It seems that whenever whenever there's a discussion about faith, there's always, we kind of get up to a point where we have to jump, right? And that's emunah. That's the part where you have to jump into faith. There's the logic that takes us so far, and then there's the part where the invisible God that we can't explain, and when we do explain it, it must be infinite, and it must be like everything else we don't understand. We jump to this point where it becomes relatively illogical, which is the basis of our existence, which is wonderful and beautiful and all those things.
Okay, so the way I would not go with that. The approach you just described is not the approach I would take. To me, it begins with rational. You know how we know there's a black hole? No one's ever seen a black hole. We know because its effects on the surrounding environment. I've never seen the builder of this building, but I don't need faith to believe that someone built it. You agree? So I'm not sure why we have to use the word faith. When you talk about the design argument, you don't need faith. It's the idea that anything with design has a designer. Now, we may not know who the designer is, and we may not know what type of personality. Then you may need to enter the realm of faith to get there. But I'm not sure why you want to go there. If you feel you don't want to go there, don't. Then stop at that point and say there's a designer, created this all with a purpose, and I'm part of that creation. I have to fulfill that purpose. If you don't want to go further. I'm not sure why you're insisting on going further and then asking a question about it. Explain to me why you need to go further. If you do need, I can tell you why I would go further. Because I would like to know something about this designer. I want to get to know who created me. And I'd like to know what his intentions are. So that's why I would go further. So then you have two options. You either can go with logic as far as you can go, or, remember, in Judaism, the statement is that God gave us the Torah, and He revealed Himself through that Torah in us, to us. So you can get to know Him by Him documenting His personality to some extent.
Can you even
Another thing is that God created us in the divine image, the Torah says. Which means if you look at your body and you look at existence, you can actually understand God's mind. Because He created us in an image that God manifested in. Now, you could say you don't believe that the Torah is from God. That's fair. But I need to know where you're coming from before I respond. Where do you want to go? Where don't you want to go? So I'm not sure I need to know what your statement is and then what your question is. I'm trying to present here a different approach, but you don't have to. You don't want to go further, don't go further. I tell people, hey, you know what? You want to just know there's a designer? Great. But anyway, my approach in general is not to preach and to convince people of anything. I'm just having a conversation here about it, a discussion. So, what's your response to what I just said?
A longer conversation.
Okay.
Can she define what she is?
No, I mean, also, as I said, my main part of a big part of this talk was, every one of us grew up in our own environment. We've been taught all kinds of things about God and about Torah and about Judaism. It could very well be the axioms that you are accepting or you were taught, maybe axioms that I don't accept. So we need to first establish what's a given, what's not a given. If you go pure logic, designer argument is a very solid argument. How far it goes, because someone can say, okay, fine, God designed the universe, He created the universe, but who said He gave us a Torah? That doesn't prove, just because an architect built his building doesn't mean he gave us a guide to understand the building. So there's arguments for that, and it all depends. I would see this as a very personal journey. Each one of us has to ask the right questions. I think the biggest thing that can come out of this conversation here is, don't be afraid to ask, pursue it. There are people that can talk about it, and you'll be surprised to find relevant answers more than you've ever expected. Don't buy into the stereotypes that we just don't understand things. It's not true. I will just tell you one story I heard recently. There was a guy, a hippie, in the mid-60s. He wandered into a yeshiva in Jerusalem. I heard this from one of the guys that was in the yeshiva. His name is Rabbi Shlomo Tachtel. His wife is the principal in Beis Rivka in New York. So he studied, it was Brisk, the Brisk Yeshiva in Yerushalayim. Very intense Talmudic academy. It was for the geniuses. It was like for the higher the students with the more brilliant students.
Is it better than mayor?
And this guy wanders in, American. He had red hair till his shoulders. And none of them spoke English except one guy. And he said, what is this? They say yeshiva. They said, can someone tell me how Jews understand God? They were all lost. He translated to the Brisk Yeshiva. They could all talk about the Talmud forever, but no one of them could talk about God. What is God like? So one of them said, I think Asher Lemel Cohen, a big chassid in Meir Sha'arim, he's the guy, let's take him to him. So I found it to be very interesting. They have one guy in Jerusalem that can talk about God. So they can talk about Torah, but not about God. Anyway, so they took this young guy with the red hair, and 4 of the students were so intrigued, they decided they're all going to go. And they all said, you know what? He'll probably give them a 5-minute, 10-minute talk, and that's that. For 4.5 hours, this rabbi started talking about God in Hebrew, and someone translated, and they couldn't believe it, that there's a Jew that can speak about God for 4.5 hours and not redundant. And then they realized that there's a whole school of thought that talks about God, yes, and godliness and godly personality, so to speak. It's essentially the teachings of Kabbalah and Hasidic thought. The Talmud is filled with it too, but it's more cryptic and more between the lines, and you have to know how to interpret it. And it just came to mind that some people don't even know that there's a lot to say about God, much more than we may imagine. So I encourage everyone here to take this to the next level and demand and push and provoke until you get your answers. That's the whole story of Pesach, right? Go ahead.
I went to yeshiva my whole life, and the first time I heard about God was when I went to Neve Yerushalayim in Israel. And it's really sad that the yeshivas don't talk about God. They just miss the opportunity for the kids to ask questions and come back to the basics.
You got it. That's it. You just confirmed what I just said. I know. Yeah. Did it do enough damage in your life? Almost. Okay. No, beautiful. Glad to hear. Go ahead.
We realize that we are semi-robotic animals. We are It's semi-robotic.
You know, you speak, you're too dogmatic for me. You're too dogmatic for me. Anyway, thank you.
That's the fact. You see, I'm moving my hand. It's all automatic. Everything is automatic.
But you can do a kind deed to someone and it's not so robotic. Anyway, thank you so much. It was beautiful. Great to see you all.
So yesterday, I was standing waiting to come in. I was waiting